All right, welcome to Decisions at the Fulcrum. I'm William, and this is a podcast about how communication sits at the center of consequential decision making in organizations and communities and in moments when interpretation can shape what comes next. So, on this show, I typically review case studies from a communication perspective. I consider them fulcrum point decisions that don't emerge spontaneously. If you look back retrospectively, you can always say they emerge through dialogue and the ways that people understand one another, or sometimes fail to understand one another. So today, we have a widely respected guest joining us, Jake McKee. Jake's career has focused on customer conversations, community, and how organizations learn from people that they serve. And more recently, he has developed AIX, which my understanding is that it centers on communication in the realm of AI, design, and interviewing. A conversation is a strategic competency that influences decision quality. That's what drew me in. And what people understand about customers typically travels sometimes through dashboards or through summaries or secondhand retellings. I kind of see your work as exploring the distortions that can occur in that process and the shifts that can occur when teams revert to direct conversation instead. So thanks for being here. My first question is, when organizations rely on those secondhand representations of customers through dashboards, reports, or analytics, what do you think changes when they move back to direct conversation?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And thanks for having me on the podcast. I always like talking about this stuff, as I'm sure you'll soon discover.
Wonderful.
I'm a longtime community guy, and I have been doing community work of some sort. How do we create channels and strategies and programs for direct customer engagement, meaning actually talking to those people who are our most enthusiastic and loyal customers, users, members, whatever the word is for our companies. How do we create a connection between business growth and business value, business impact, and those direct customer conversations that yield a very positive, growth in loyalty, growth in identity, growth in connection between company and customer, between product team and creative team. Just generally speaking, how do we have better conversations? One of the things I've noticed over the years in doing this work and always being fairly adjacent to product teams is that product teams in particular have this weird moment that they're finding themselves in, that they are increasingly being told or pushed to rely on secondhand insights, right? As you said, dashboards or survey reports or voice of the customer documents or the sales team saying, here's what I'm hearing, I need you guys to act on that, right? And the reality is that I think a lot of that has happened more naturally than we might want to admit, not because of any shortcomings from anybody in particular, from any team in particular, but I think from a cultural standpoint that we see in sort of Western business, where it's increasingly focused on risk aversion and risk avoidance, right? Both those things mean the same thing, I suppose, but avoiding the risk at all costs, right?
Yeah.
How do we sort of restructure ourselves, our team? Is it better to take a risk and fail and noticeably fail than it is to take a risk that is much, much smaller or very little risk at all and not be called in on the carpet, right? To atone for our sins. And I think this idea of conversation is really the core of what that community work all these years have been doing, right? It fundamentally, I had sort of one of my favorite jobs of all time was when I was at Lego, as you may be imagining that a favorite one, of course.
Yeah.
But I established the relationship between the adult fan community, people who are building with Lego bricks as a creative medium, typically 18 plus, and the company itself. Right. And that took a lot of work to try and kind of refocus and reshape their thinking about what those conversations, what those connections were really worth to the business. And it took a number of years to get through that process. And now, and we went from trying to convince people that it was 1% of our buying audience, but more impact than that, not sales directly, but indirect impact of sales, to now, last I heard, it's 45% of their business, right? Are those 18 plus buyers. And you can tell from the shelves on the Target store. But so much of that wasn't just strategic intent that was gifted by the CEO down to the middle managers who then acted on it immediately, right? it was a lot of internal and external conversation. It was a lot
Yeah.
of work to be finding what really works and what resonates, not only for the customer base, but for our internal colleagues too. How do we start to talk about the impact of secondhand insights? If you give an engineer a voice of the customer report and a backlog and say, go understand everything, it's sort of like giving the War and Peace novel, which is a very hard to read novel, to a beginner reader and saying, tell me what it means, write up a report. They're like, I didn't even know where to start to do this, right? But if you start talking to them about the ideas and the
Right.
themes, then they may start to come closer to you. They may start to understand the book, even though you don't have to get them fully immersed in it. I think a lot of that same work is what I do for a living, which is to help product teams in particular, but really any team who's trying to get past this secondhand insights thing and start developing their own customer relationships, having their own conversations, maybe alongside those other teams, so that there's some great synthesis that can happen. But fundamentally, not just sort of turning it over to the dashboards and the reports and the data streams, so to speak.
And I was wondering, to follow on that, what shows up in live conversations that doesn't survive the translation into metrics or summaries? I completely agree that is more, it's certainly become more something that companies depend on today and assume that can replace that conversation, I think. So I was wondering what shows up in live conversation that doesn't survive, or what tends to get lost in the translation. Either one, either way, you've seen it.
Yeah, let me first tell you. Let me answer that by way of story. I'm a
Yeah.
community guy. I like to talk about
Yeah.
stories of people doing things together, right? I have a friend who works at a company selling to engineers, and he took five of his engineers to meet with five engineers from a client company, right? A traditional customer visit. They went out with a list of questions that was very, their team centric, right? We have all these questions. We want to ask these questions, and we want to get these answers to these questions. It's very typical, almost a quantitative version, an engineering version of having that conversation. And they went out and they talked for several hours with this group. The group was excited to share feedback with them, and they furiously took notes, uh, built up, multiple pieces of paper and half a moleskin, whatever it was, full of notes. And they said, "Okay, thank you very much." Shook their hand, left, and went away for a month. Didn't really talk to them or have much follow up after that. And then turned back around a month later and reached out to them and said, "Hey guys, all those things you said you wanted us to do, we've done them all." And they went, "Okay, thanks." And then what?
Yeah.
And my buddy was talking to me because he's
Yeah.
like, I've heard you speak. We've talked before. I've been on your events before, but what happened? I expected that they would have, a lot more enthusiasm, that they would have been like, "Oh, you guys are the greatest."
Right.
And I said, "Well, let's back up a second and look at the whole way that this flows out from how you described it. It was not a relationship building or a connection oriented activity. It was a data gathering activity. Nobody connects to data gathering activity, right? There's no emotional complexity there.
No.
And if there's no, if it's all smooth and risk adverse business conversation, there's no friction, which seems great from the risk aversion standpoint. But from the human connection standpoint, smooth is where we slip off and fall into the abyss, right?
Yeah.
The handholds, the things that add friction, that's where we slow down and have a chance to grab a hold of something, right? And
Yeah.
I will say that, that conversation I'm alluding to, that my buddy was telling me about, the reality of that situation was that they weren't building a relationship. If they had been thinking about it from a relational standpoint, they would have done some prep work. Hey guys, here's generally what we want to show up and talk about. Can you show us the factory? We really want to understand your workspace. Tell us who you are, right? Be prepared for that. And then when they sat down, the day before, hey, really excited to come meet you and talk to you. Where can we go to dinner and lunch, or whatever would have worked out for them, so that it wasn't just a data gathering, sit down, answer the questions, then we leave. Police interview, police interrogation, right? That it would have been a much more friendly warm up to that process. When they sat down, my guess is they didn't have a lot of conversation that was considered, especially to engineers, pointless chit chat. right? But the pointless chit chat, any good conversationalist knows how to have that pointless chit chat in a way that does something really effective. It warms everybody up. It starts to present them. They are allowed to present themselves in a more personal and realistic and emotional way. So you'd ask, like, what's the, I'm simplifying your question, but what's the value of showing up in person, or even if virtual? We're still in person talking to each other on Zoom here today.
I agree. Yeah.
When we show up in front of somebody, what we're seeing is the way that they react, the way that they position themselves. And it's not just body language, but that's a huge part of it. Part of it is the questions they ask, right? Sometimes the most interesting questions are when you present an idea to somebody for the first time, and really being able to pay attention for not just the words, but the reactions, the emotion that comes out of it, right? The directions that they go in about that thing when they hear it for the first time. When we've heard an idea 3 or 4 or 5 times, we sort of onboarded at that point 3 or 4 or 5 times in. It's sort of onboarded into our brains as a given, or in the context that we've already said, or those sorts of things. But the first time we hear it, it gives you a whole lot of insight into how that person's reacting to that. Product managers love my methodology. Sorry, product marketers love my methodology, because before the product's ever even on the shelves, or they've even interviewed the first potential buyer in a product marketing context, they can already know, boy, it was one thing when we talked about this long list of backlog bug fixes that we've been working on for 6 months. But the thing that only took us 2 days to decide we're going to do this weird color of blue for that's where everybody lit up. We've got to figure out how to put more focus on that. Maybe it's not about, hey, we're really doing a great update and adding these great features. Maybe it's this other thing that, to us who've been immersed in this for 30 months, 6 months, a year and a half, who knows how long this product has taken to develop, right? We've been so immersed in that development cycle that we've lost track of the joy of it, right? And that's natural, but that's why you have these conversations, and it's why you go out as much as you can, do them in person or staring at another human.
Sure.
Because when you do, you really pick up on, the little glint in their eye that they don't even know they're having.
Yeah.
It allows you to follow, to be curious in ways that you couldn't do through more formalized methodologies, right? Nothing against market research, voice of the customer reports, the feedback that we get from sales or support. Those are part of the mix, right? But the part that's also missing in that mix has been this conversational approach, right? It's that, a great conversationalist, whether you go all the way back to, Dale Carnegie's, How to Win Friends and Influence People book that was, decades ago, or anything that you see online today, a huge part of how you have great conversations to be curious, to follow paths and interesting prompts and ideas that you might not have otherwise had. And when you're doing traditional research, there's not as much space for that, right? And there's not as much room to be guided by not just the other person's emotions, but your own emotions. Hey, when you said that, I got really excited. Do you know why? Help me understand what just happened for you that made me go, bah. These are very different questions than you get in traditional market research. Again, nothing against those. Those are an important part of the mix. But we are kind of missing, I think, as a business industry generally, this idea of the soft conversational skills and allowing curiosity and connection to and that relationship building to guide us through that knowledge.
It sounds like allowing for that, like that messiness to exist in the space where, it can only come out in those human moments. It's sort of like how people have become a little bit more, a little bit less comfortable with that messiness and we like receiving the clean data. But it seems like when, first of all, I want to say, like, that seems to re-examine the issue in a much more practical way too. So when communication improves in the way that you're describing, what part of decision quality do you think changes first? Like, is it the priorities that get more clear? Is it the judgment that improves? Is it alignment that gets easier? Or do people just trust themselves in making the decisions more? I threw a lot out there, but you can take any of the threads or go in a different direction. Yeah.
All of those are valid, relevant parts of the mix, right? I think those all matter. When we start having better conversations, we get a couple of big things. One is that we generate, but also are able to test more hypothesis that we develop in our own minds. And that's an important one I'll come back to in just a second. We're also able to explore a lot of other paths that we might not otherwise been able to, both for how we've structured it. If you've worked with a marketing research team, a lot of times if you're not a market researcher yourself and you're on a product team or you're on a marketing team, a lot of times what you're doing is writing a brief for the market researchers to then go research. Where do those hypotheses come from that you need them to dig in on? Right? How are you charging them to march down the market research path that could very well yield some amazing results before you have a hypothesis? The conversational, it is, and the conversational approach is, I think, sort of a before, during, and after development process, not just the bookends of research up front or testing at the end, but as you're developing as well, right? How do you sort of in the upfront? How do you create those hypotheses? How do you start to have enough conversations where things, ideas, understandings, connection points, synapses connecting in your brain, right, that have never connected before, that may not have ever connected for anybody because nobody's really had that freedom to sort of play with in conversation. If you sit down with a friend and talk in conversation, there's stuff that you start to hear from them because they're now starting to open up, that your brain naturally starts to create patterns that might not have otherwise existed if you hadn't been at lunch with them for 2 hours and maybe having a margarita and they're getting a little bit loose, right? And they're starting to open up and be a little bit more vulnerable.
How many do you have?
Exactly. And as you get more vulnerable generally, not just from the margarita, but just from the comfort, right? The relationship itself. You start to expose more of your true self. And when you do that, it's easier to understand better pattern recognition and to believe when they say what they say. How many times have we heard from a customer, a client, a member, whoever the group is that we're selling to, that they want this thing or they like this thing, and then you give them that thing and they go, well, I don't know what I need that thing for, or that's great, and then they never use it. Right? The product, especially the digital product space, is littered with things that have been added to a web app, for instance, that seem like a really great idea, or in a direct correlation with 90% of our surveyed audience wanted it. It turns out they didn't actually want it, what they were trying to get at, but you didn't give them enough time, or they didn't have the clear enough words early on in a traditional research approach to share with you what the real issue was. Right? It's the product folks always talk about the jobs to be done framework. That it's not really saying what kind of car do you want? It's where do you need to go? Because if you say, I need to go to the grocery store, and then all of a sudden you discover that there's a way to, create a levitating mag train or something to go straight to and from the grocery store from your house, then that's a much better solution than giving you a faster car or a better car, a bigger car, whatever. Or, the idea of Instacart, becoming a thing, because it wasn't that I was too busy for grocery shopping, is I didn't like going to the grocery store. And I was willing to pay a premium to not ever have to step foot in the grocery store again and just be able to digitally shop. Right? That, for me, that's a huge part of it. We all have our chores we don't like, and going to the grocery store is definitely mine. But that's the jobs to be done. I don't want going to the grocery store. Not that I need a better route or a better car or a better shopping cart when I get there to deal with it, because fundamentally I don't want to go to the grocery store. So
you don't need a grocery store, right?
Right. Yeah. If I meet our local chain here is the HEBs. And, somebody from the HEB grocery stores came to me and said, hey, I want to interview you about your in-store experience. Then they may be, the decisions that they may make based on my information may be really skewed because, I'm answering those questions, but I'm not really getting to the point of what needs to happen. And they wouldn't, it's just sending me a survey or doing more traditional research that isn't tied to the team itself, right? It's you're hiring somebody to pick up the phone and randomly call somebody, or you're sending out a survey, or you're having a market researcher who's not in the grocery store business, for instance, in this example. So you're avoiding some of that that secondhand sort of transfer problem, but you're also creating a lot better ways for you to identify patterns and understandings that you wouldn't have otherwise had if you couldn't sort of explore and be curious I've talked to market researchers about this, and they say, some of them will say, well, that's how we do our research. And I'm like,
I can
yes,
hear
within a
that. Yeah.
context, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And you don't tend to create relationship over time.
Yeah.
This is a qualitative, not a quantitative process. And so, I was speaking to a group of market researchers recently, and one of them in the Q&A session said, "This all sounds great, but it doesn't sound very quantitative." And I said, "It's not, and I don't care. That's not my job. That's your job. My job is to figure out how to understand the
Yeah.
hypothesis, to develop some insights that are interesting enough to explore, to clarify with customers in a way that the product team can hear. Sometimes the data comes through, but the decision making isn't based on that data or those insights. It's based on internal politics or emotions from the team or the burnout from the team or whatever it might be, right? Internal budgets. But having that voice, the actual voice and relationship with the customer, not just the voice of the customer research, but their voice and their relationship to you and you to them, it allows you to go a lot further and have a lot better understanding of the emotional drivers that are powering so much of our products today, right? There's a lot of products out there that, yeah, they may be higher quality, but it's not the higher quality itself that's selling it. It's the fact that it's the white when everything else is black, right? Or it's the fact that it's, it becomes collectible in a way that products may not be collectible, right? Traditionally, but understanding that and understanding that you can put a lot of energy and effort into designing the net new features when in reality the stuff people want is maybe more pedestrian, or it may be something that literally they don't want you to change the product at all. They just want to be able to buy it in 3 colors.
Yeah.
Innovation in
The strong design choice, cursory on the surface. What I'm hearing is that better communication changes decision quality in very concrete ways. And I can pivot now to the conversation lab. It seems like your way of helping people build that capability intentionally. First, is that an accurate description? And can you tell me like what it is and what problems it's designed to solve?
Yeah. The framework that I've been using for many years, and I've sort of more recently formalized into a thing that I'm calling the customer conversation compass.
I've read about
and
that.
the compass is sort of a series of methodologies and frameworks and approaches and processes and just my own experience and knowledge that I put together under 5 sort of core pillars. But overall, it's sort of the compass guides product teams, marketing teams, whoever might be hiring me. Traditionally, it's product teams to really understand how to improve their conversation. It's one thing, and product teams hear this all the time these days, that they need to be more customer centric, but nobody's teaching them how.
Yeah.
Right. Nobody's giving them a structure of what that looks like or what that would feel like or how to get there. So the compass is my methodology for doing this, and it has 5 big components: conversation debt. Where are we coming up short? Where are we not doing what we should be doing more of? Right? What do we need to put in sort of our conversation backlog, so to speak? Right? So we may have talked about having these conversations, but we never prioritized them, or we had a really really bad customer advisory board meeting recently. How do we that's a debt now, right? We were only able to budget for 10 of our top 50 users to come meet us in the office, right? And we really should have had all 50, but we're all 20 or whatever the number is. But we can only bring 5 or 10 because we couldn't convince the company to have, to budget for that. Those are all debts, right? So that's piece 1. And in no particular order, piece 2 is the conversational tuning, right? So how do you start to just look at what you're doing and start to make smaller changes and smaller tweaks? Hopefully all this is based on a conversation architecture, right? Anything we do in business, we can do more humanistic and more planned. And no, those two aren't in conflict. I do better at having really great conversation if I know some techniques, if I know when to talk to somebody, if I know what they're expecting of me. This is part of the architecture that goes into, we've got a customer advisory board, and we've got a super fan program on our website, and we've got an online community, and we've got, some people that we reach out to bring in when we're doing product design reviews in the mid.
Checked all the boxes.
We checked all the boxes, but none of it works together, and nobody's been trained on how to do any of those pieces effectively, right? And we don't have any strategy for when we do this, it affects this other thing. And that's the architecture piece.
Yeah.
And then the last 2 are the amplification process. So when we have conversation, how are we promoting it inside the company? How is a product team that has those direct conversations using the outcome of that internally and externally to create impact for the business and for the customer base as well, right? Sometimes you can launch products that are fantastic, but because they're new and you surprised your customer base, that can create huge problems, right? Just because it was surprising, shocking that we're doing something new. Is it better? Well, yeah, it's better, but it's not what I'm used to and I'm mad, right? Very different than launching where you say, we've been working with 50 representative voices from the customer base and you all recognize them and they are on board with this. And here, I'm not going to talk. Let me turn that over to you and let them talk to you about it, right? That's a different kind of conversation. That's the kind of the amplification process. We're hearing, we're learning, we're doing, but how do we amplify that back to help us build our relationship and our impact? And then the last one is just traction. How do we actually go about applying this? A product team goes out and has these conversations. They learn some really great things. Sometimes turning those things into action, especially if they were surprising, especially if they were out of the realm of normalcy that we've been working under. There's a whole process for how do we get people to think about applying it. And so that's the conversation compass. I have a few activities that I do around, I'm a community guy at heart. I've got to bring people together, right? So that's my conversation lab event. It's a small group, different group of 5 smart people from all kinds of industries, from product to community to support to CX to the product, obviously. And it's really just meant to sort of bring together 5 people who are working in the space with or around or are impacted by customer conversation, community building, member engagement, those sorts of things where we're really directly connecting with customers. And it's a great event. I've been doing it for about 7 years, once a month, always a different group of 5 people, even if you've come back more than once. So very unique and interesting conversations that happen in that. And most fun part about that is I get to come up with a box of snacks for every event that I send to the attendees in advance. But nothing like tasty snacks that you can pair in interesting ways.
Sometimes that's the hard part, talking, right? Is what snacks do I select? Yeah,
that is true. And then I also have the Conversation Lab podcast that I'm just about to drop the trailer episode for.
Yes,
that will be sort of conversation about conversation. With people that are interesting in adjacent industries. I have to have you on at some point to talk about your higher experience. Yeah, and then the last piece is my field notes, the Conversation Lab field notes. That's my LinkedIn and about to be Substack newsletter that people can sign up for, and kind of long form deep dive into some of these conversational principles. If you want to get real nerdy, that's the place for it.
That's my favorite place to live on this show is where it's nerdy. So yeah, if you're comfortable using the Lego case, I know we're getting close on time, but if you're comfortable using the Lego case or another example you think works better, can you walk the audience walk us through a moment where conversation changed the trajectory of a decision that was made?
Yes, there's a number of those given that experience I had that, I had to convince an entire, large, established, very Danish company that there was a different and better way to do something. So when I joined, it was a company that was a toy maker for boys 7 to 12. They did some other things, but fundamentally, that's who they were. That was their DNA. That's what they wanted to pay attention to. It's where the budgets were. And when I came in and I said, hey, that's cool and all, but I want you to pay attention to the 18 plus adults who are, especially, back then, that are using Lego as a creative medium, not a toy. They all went, what? No, not possible. Not what I want. Not possible.
Yeah.
And it took, the story there is one that is highly conversational based, right? The community building, community management that I did as that liaison or that bridge between the adult fans and the company and the adult fans, it was hugely driven by conversation. I had conversations internally. My favorite story of probably all of business to tell is how when people didn't want to talk to me because I got better things to do. You're talking about a tiny little percentage of the audience, the buying audience, and I'm dealing with these major deadlines. Decline that meeting. Well, I finally realized as I was sort of paying attention to I was paying attention to the surroundings I was operating in. And it dawned on me one random day that if I see somebody leave a person's office, that person I've been wanting to meet with, if I see them meeting with somebody else and that person leaves at, let's say, 2:25, I know I either have 5 minutes left until their next meeting, or I've got 35 minutes left until their next meeting, right? Because nobody schedules a meeting to end at 2:25. And so I would stand outside their office when I really needed to talk to them. And when I saw that person leave, I'd say, "Hey, what's up?" And then I'd walk in, sit right down, and start talking. And pretty soon they realized it was a lot easier for me to just, for them to just accept my meeting requests so that they could do it on their terms, right?
Right.
But it was understanding, that story started with those sorts of internal conversational understandings that I had to sort of push through to get to that conversational point. If I relied on a more research-oriented approach, I would have gotten a bunch of answers that said, "I'm not interested in participating because this isn't a big enough part of the business for me to pay attention to, or it's not in my scope specifically, or it's not something that I'm interested in," right? And so that was one part of it. That was the internal part. Externally, there was a lot of conversation as this connection between company and customer, the adult customer base, which had never existed before, really. I was the first person to come in and say, "We're going to formalize this and build some real programs around it, some real products around it, some real events, and you name it. We were going to put a strategic, directed, supported effort behind it." And that was also a ton of conversation, because there was a lot of these adult fans that, especially in those early days, in the transition period between when you'd go to an office building and the one guy that had Lego sitting on his desk, everybody kind of stayed away from because they thought he was the weirdo playing with kids' toys, to today where there's Lego on everybody's desks everywhere, women,
And
men, young,
in the
old, doesn't
lobby,
matter.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, and in the lobby, right? The CEOs, taking a Lego break during one of their meetings, whatever it might be.
Certainly, yeah.
In that transition period, there was a lot of conversation that I had to have with the community. So I'd show up in person a lot. I'd listen a lot. Once I started listening and hearing themes, I'd start testing those themes.
Yeah.
I'd really start to carry ideas back and forth between the companies, and then make sure that there was a conversation about, "Hey, I really like that idea from you last month. Here's what I did about it." And indirectly or directly, but often indirectly, here's the outcome. You're seeing this thing. Let me walk this backwards for you so you can see how it got there. Oh man, that's amazing. Now I've created an unwaveringly loyal person, not just a loyal person, an unwaveringly loyal person. So even if I screwed up something the next week, there was some forgiveness there, right?
Yeah.
But it was very conversational based to get to a point of understanding what needed to be programatized, right? What could I get to a point of building strategy around? What could I get to a point of justifying a budget request for? Because I needed to see how things played out over time. I needed to see what people reacted to. I needed to hear messages and what they looked like before I got to the point of saying, "Hey, boss, I want X number of dollars for this campaign to do this activity for this period of time," right? It was very much sort of the core of that community building. Conversation plays such a significant role in our worlds, but when we walk into the through the physical or virtual doors of the office building, that a lot of that kind of disappears on us. We do a lot of conversation with our friends, with our significant others, with our kids, with our therapists, even with our bosses, with our colleagues. But we kind of lose track of that, or think that that's not an important business skill, when I think it's one of the most important business skills, honestly.
Yeah, that's the kind of decision hinge that I think that I can really take from our conversation today. And I think when we think about decision making in general, you talked a little bit about the resistance that shows up. My next question is, what do you think an organization would have done, like Lego, if they hadn't considered conversation as central? What do you think happens then?
Well, so I'll take a step back and answer that slightly differently.
Sure.
Maybe you're asking it, but when I share this part, tell me if I'm missing a component of your question. Sometimes conversation is driven very specifically, right? And that's part of what I'm trying to do these days, is to help product team leaders and product team members really too, but especially leadership, to understand that there is something that's coming up short, that they are putting themselves at risk as their competitors do better at understanding and listening to customers. We're at a really amazing point in the history of humankind where it is so incredibly easy to connect to the people that we want to talk to.
It's
whether
really
it's
insightful.
personal, yeah,
Mhm.
but also through business, right? If you still told me tomorrow, go find me three people that I could talk to that meet these lists of criteria. In years past, it might have taken months to find those three people, right? It takes minutes now,
Yeah. I was going to
and
say like just a few minutes. I was thinking hours, but I was like, that's not right. It's closer to minutes. Yeah.
yeah, I think that in that in that reality, in that realm, and we start talking about conversation. It seems so easy because it's so easy to have a conversation. It seems so easy skills wise to convince yourself that you know how to have a great conversation. This is a very specific type of conversation that I think a lot of people don't always have the skills for, and we know this in our personal lives too, right? There are people that if I thought about it for a second, I can name three people off the top of my head that if you put them in, I mean, if you parachuted them into any environment, within 10 minutes, they've got three best friends, right?
Yeah.
And that's a conversational skill issue. My younger life, I was not that guy. I've had to learn this ability to talk about ideas
Yeah.
and
Same
can make
here.
connections and that sort of thing over time.
Yeah.
But I did learn it. It was something that with practice and structure, it helped.
So, yeah.
Um,
Same. Repeating it
but
over.
and I
Yeah.
think that it is a soft skill that can and should be taught. And I think that we do need to be more proactive about it, right? That's the piece of this. Back to your question, how do we kind of drive this conversational approach? There's so many places where it seems unimportant. There's so many people who believe that it might be unimportant, or that it's too risky, or those sorts of things. But risk is often just a lack of clarity and practice. And if we can solve clarity and practice,
Yeah.
it's not so risky anymore, right? A great example of that is that I would have a hard time walking in tomorrow to any random company and talking to one of the sales executives and saying, just trust me, I want to put one of the product team members in your next sales call. And to participate, not just to listen, but to participate. I'm sure
Distinction.
you can imagine and I'm sure you can imagine the reaction that salesperson might have. Oh my God, they're going to mess up my sale. Well, why? Well, because they haven't been taught how to be on those kind of calls, and not from I'm going to be a sales engineer on a sales call kind of way, but just I'm going to be a good conversationalist. I'm going to be there. I'm going to listen. I'm going to ask questions that are interesting to me. I'm going to ask questions in a way that makes the other person feel really good about responding, right? It doesn't seem obtrusive because I'm asking about their pain points. I'm asking about who they are. I'm being curious about them. And there's very few humans alive that don't want somebody to be curious about who they are as a person, right? But teaching those skills so that when they show up, they're a net additive, not a net negative on those sorts of pre-existing conversations or pre-existing relationships. Much less to have their own, right? To be able to go out and, finding that group of people is a skill. There's a lot of dependencies on what good looks like when you're trying to find an engineer to talk to. I think a lot about criteria like overall customer based impact. If I have five people to choose from that are equally great, I have one slot, I'm going to choose one slot for the person who, when they speak, other people listen. They may not be the best person to get opinions from, but if they're bought in, if the goal of the conversation is connection, not just knowledge gathering, and it doesn't always have to be one thing or the other, it could be multiple. But if I go into a situation where I just want to see some reactions, I want to start to talk to the community before we actually get so far down the path that if something shows up unexpectedly, we can still make changes. So I'm going to go talk to that community customer base, and I'm going to do it through a small number of manageable amounts of conversation with people that when I talk to them, I get great opinions. Is it the best? Is it the most insightful, the best spoken? Maybe, maybe not. But even if it's not, if they're the ones that as soon as we sort of release them to go talk about it openly, they're out there saying, no, guys, listen, here's why they did that. And we don't have to say it. It's one of their own, so to speak, that's saying it on our behalf. I mean, the reaction and the response is radically different. But, this is that conversation architecture. Where and how and what are you trying to achieve?
It also seems like a way that they can prevent going into that conversation debt that you were talking about as part of the compass by making that a priority. And by
the debt piece is always going to be there, right? I've been with my wife now 8 years, and there are still moments where I'm like, what are the words that are coming out of your mouth? I do not understand what you're saying or what you're trying to get at or why you're talking about it, right?
Yeah.
And then she tells me something, and I'm like, oh, that's just a different and newly discovered version of this other thing. right? And this other way you
That's what you meant
bring
the whole
this
time.
topic up.
Yeah.
That's what you meant. I knew this. I just didn't know that you were saying it that way today.
Yeah.
Or you start off in the middle of the story and I didn't understand that, right? So I think there's always going to be conversation debt. Just like in any good web app, there's always going to be technology debt, right? There's always going to be a backlog, because if there's no backlog, you've run out of ideas. You've run out of use cases, right? Customers aren't stepping up and saying, there's a problem and I'm using this product so hard that this isn't working, or this needs to be better, more efficient, and whatever, right?
Yeah.
There's always going to be a debt to that. The goal is to get the debt to be as low as realistically to create process. This is the architecture piece, and the process and the tuning activities of continually improving and continually moving forward, so that even the conversational failures fundamentally add to the relationship, don't subtract from it. Again, friction can be good for building a relationship. Smoothness is not. We can't grab onto anything. We can't get to know somebody for real if there's not a little bit of friction, or they don't, say a few ums and ahs every once in a while, or they don't go, hang on, I'm not making any sense. Let me start over. That's when I go, oh, this is a person I can connect with, right? So we don't ever want to try and eliminate debt. We just want to get it into a manageable state that is being addressed with processes that improve the overall outcome, and that our debt becomes less table stakes and more fantastic future, right?
I think I read somewhere like you believe everyone should go home happy. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Is that what I'm saying? Right?
That is
okay.
That is my fundamental 20-something-year-old mantra that I came up with when I was first starting to talk to colleagues. I'm surprised it's taken me this long on this recording to get to everybody goes home happy, because I say it a lot. It's because when we start talking about some of these soft skills, some of these indirect, impact opportunities, right? With community, with conversation, we're never going to say we're doing this because when we have a good conversation, it yields us directly attributable X number of dollars. It's not what this is meant to do. That doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact, right? It doesn't mean that us having better understanding will then lead to better products that lead directly to better revenue, right? And that's something that's really important in this process. But years ago, when I was starting to talk about the adult fans to my Lego colleagues, I'd say, hey, I want to trim off a little bit of your marketing budget. $500, right? It's not a huge amount of money. I just don't have any money. So I want you to help give me some of your very fat marketing budget, right? And here's what we can do with it. And their first reaction was, and it's been fascinating to me for all these years, I think about it a lot, like, why was their first reaction to go straight to, well, I can't just give up my budget?
Yeah.
Oh, no, that was not the ask. The ask isn't to do something totally different. The ask is to have you rethink what you're doing in a way that creates new opportunities, right?
Yeah.
I kept finding myself saying over and over again, if everybody doesn't go home happy, me, you, the company, the community, then we're not doing the right things. This is this situation where, in order to do really great indirect connection and have it mean anything, everybody's got to feel impact. I have to know what really, as a company employee, I have to know what really motivates the community. And I have to be able to tell them and articulate that. Hey, here's what I think what I'm hearing from you, and therefore here's what we're doing. By the same token, I have to be bold enough as a member of the company to say, and I can do that for you if we get to these points. If you're wanting these types of really unique and odd kits, then I need to make sure that we have these sort of potential avenues open so that they can see why that's important to have those unique things. Otherwise, it just stays in the conversation that's either me, you, the community member, saying, I want this unique thing and that's all I'm interested in. And the company stays in the mindset of doing small run batches is expensive. We don't like expensive. And then we're done, right? Nobody gets anything. But when you start saying, if we were to go ahead and accept a lower margin on this particular small run product, it actually creates this opportunity over here for this other thing that gives them a delight, which then gives them more chance to go out there and get on the front page of the Sunday LA Times lifestyle section, which happened once with one of the Lego fan events. That's a huge, that's a piece of media that they couldn't have bought, would have had a hard time getting it with a product oriented message. Yet here was Lego the brand splashed all over this thing in a way that was much more humanistic and non-salesy, and that had a really great impact on the company, right? So that was a great example that everybody goes home happy mantra. Is I started saying, when fans would say things like, "Hey, can you send us some free sets to give away as part of our raffle?" I'd say, I hear that you guys who are starting this local event and don't have a lot of money to do it, and won't have because it's a local event for relatively small crowd. You're wanting some stuff to make the event cooler. Well, tell you what, I hear you. You want to do that. I'll send you a box of stuff in exchange for you making sure that you alert the local media that you're doing this event. And then local news stations show up or write a newspaper article or bring their cameras out, put them on the nightly news or whatever. And everybody went home happy in that case. They got what they needed. I got what I needed. And they weren't the same by any stretch of the imagination, but they were because we were being open and honest about what we both needed.
They overlapped. I love the Venn diagrams. There's that overlap point that's the area to like stand in. It sounds like people you're working for. I guess for listeners who want to make better decisions, who want to know about making better decisions, what is one communication or conversation practice that they could practice this month that would textually or materially improve how they understand customers?
That's a great question. I'm trying to narrow down a couple of things.
Problem.
I'm going to give you two. I'm going to give you a process idea, and I'll give you sort of a thing to think about. I think for me, my single best technique for making however good you are at conversation better is curiosity. That's it.
Yeah.
Be more curious.
That's a strong place to be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what happens in a lot of conversations, whether it's me and my wife, me and my daughter, you and much less people that are your customer base, is that we go into it with our own spoken or unspoken, realized or unrealized agenda, right? I'm mad at my wife about something. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to tell her all about that. When in reality, what may be a better way to do that is to sit down and say, "Hey, you've been really short with me today. Is everything okay? How's your day?"
Yeah.
We still get to the point where she's understanding that I don't know what's going on with her, but I don't like it. But I haven't put it in a finger pointing way, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's when we're curious about a work issue, right? When we get an engineer and we say, "Hey, what's going on in your family life?" Oh, interesting. Oh, do your kids ask about your job? No, nobody cares about my job, my family. I don't know, petroleum engineering. Nobody cares about petroleum engineering. And I might say back, "Well, I'm sure somebody does." Well, yeah, I mean, other nerds.
Yeah.
Well, like what kind of nerds? Like other petroleum engineers or like any kind of engineer? Oh, no. We've got this group. And all of a sudden you're down the rabbit hole of understanding what just lit them up. And it wasn't because I was trying to tell them, I wasn't trying to give them survey questions. I was just, as one human to another, being curious about their experience, right? So that's, put the word curiosity up across your monitor if you're interested in getting better at conversation, and just remember that if you don't have any other things to do. If you want a very specific process, though, I'll give you one of those. And I've been using this more and more myself because I've been kind of reorienting my business towards this conversational focus and reorienting in a somewhat narrowing focus, but it's the same work I've always done. It's just more focused on the conversation piece. And it's new for me. It's new to talk about. And so what I've been doing is a fairly standard 3-step process that I do. I think about how I find 15 people that I want to talk to that can help me gain knowledge, but also just kind of react to what I'm doing and my new direction for my business, right? In the first 5, I just talk to. Hey, what's going on? You're a product manager. You're a product leader. What's going on in your world? Oh, interesting. Okay. Curiosity is the driver for that first batch of 5, right? Tell me what's going on. And then after the first 5, I sit back with all the notes from my sessions and I go, okay, what did I hear? These are 3 things I heard. I don't know if I heard it correctly. I don't know if I'm, it's a statistically invalid pattern, but
subtle but important.
Pattern. Yeah. Yeah, but I just got a bunch of ideas, and one idea will spark 3 others, right? So the next group of 5, after I've sort of establish those patterns. The next group of 5 is where I go to check out those patterns. Hey, so I've heard this thing before. What's going on with that thing? Does this resonate for you? Did I get this right? No. How? What would you have said? And when I come out of that second group of 5, not only did I go into it with some hypothesis, now I have them fairly well tested, right? I can really sit down and start making some more declarative statements. Here's what I know needs to be fixed. And out of this is a point I made to you earlier that I keep hearing from product teams, this group of 15 I talked to, but also others. I've been hearing the same theme come up over and over again. How do we become more customer centric like everybody keeps telling us we need to be if nobody's teaching us what that means or how to do it, right? I kept hearing that come up over and over again. So on the third group of 5, I took that and some other ideas, but that one in particular, I took that as fact. I said, oh, I'm sure that this is the same issue you're having. Instead of tell me more about this issue, if you felt it, experienced it, or in the beginning, not even doing any of that and just listening for those sorts of commonalities, right? Yeah. But in that third step, it is to really go in and say, I think this is what we need. How are you reacting to that? And so each one of those blocks, and it could be 3 people, right? 1 in each one of them. It's probably not enough people, but finding 5 or 10 or 15 people to talk to really isn't very hard, especially these days. It's so easy to look at your, ask some questions, right? Like it's, most people, most of the time, if you say, hey, I'm doing something new, I need your help, I want your insight, you're a smart person, can you break off 15 minutes or 30 minutes to talk to me? They're going to say yes, right? Most people will do that. But that's an architecture, by the way, right? That's a conversational architecture. And I use that implemented slightly differently all the time, but it is an architecture that you could learn, that you can practice, that you can tune, that you can understand where your debt is, that you can amplify the results of, and that you can use to really gain traction in whatever you're working on building. That's the compass.
Yeah. I think that gives leaders a really concrete standard and a practical way to approach these conversation in a way that's actionable and that has real results. I know that we're running over time, so I want to just say that this has been exactly the kind of conversation that I was hoping to have. And it's one that I wish for. It's thoughtful, practical, I think deeply relevant. But I really appreciate the way that you helped me and the listeners think about communication as a way, structure, architecture that can determine decision quality. So was there anything else that you wanted to add to that, or?
No, I'll end on one thought that I've been sharing with a lot of people lately is that if your communications with, to, or from your customers are especially if it's one way from you and your comms team, your PR team, your marketing team out to the users, and there's not a lot of return. It's not conversation. It's not communication. It's advertising. And there's a place and a time for that.
It's one way, important, like you're saying, it's unidirectional. Yeah,
right. But it's one way. You're not creating anything deeper. And I'll leave with this. One of my other sort of go-to concepts is what I call the octopus theory. That anything we do in community customer engagement, direct or indirect customer engagement, it should be thought of as an octopus, right? You do one thing, but it has these 8 different tentacles that stretch out, right? So you never really just go to a customer and say, I have this list of questions I want to ask you. Okay, great. You've given me data. What you're doing is thinking about, how do I get that set up? How do I use that conversation that's coming to open some doors with my colleagues and have a conversation there? How do I maybe bring them along with me so that they can see and hear and participate in not just the conversation, but the synthesis afterwards?
Yeah.
How do I take what I've heard and use that as a way to start my own internal conversations? How do I use that as a way to tell the person I talk to, look, you can't talk about what you talked about because that's top secret. We're working on our product. You're under NDA. What you can share is that you talk to us about the direction of our products generally. And we highly encourage you to go do that. And so that even as you're developing, you're starting to create this baseline enthusiasm for the pending product, and even before people know what it is, because they know that you're talking to representative voices, right?
So there's all these things. A telephone, right?
It can, but that's part of the architecture of how do you, and the amplification piece. How do you make sure that you're giving them tools to amplify that aren't being prescriptive or directive, but they are so useful for that person that came in that you say, you can't talk about this, you can't talk about that, but we really want you to talk about these things. So please go back to your community or your customer base or your industry events or whatever it might be and talk about how we invited you in. Just don't talk about what we talked about. Right?
Yeah.
Or, by the time that the product launches, being able to say, okay, whatever we talked about during the top secret time, that's over. And you have a process in place to convince them to go out there and speak on your behalf. Right. But if you're just thinking about, I have a message and I want to get it out, however that is, whether that's a comms issue, a PR issue, marketing issue, whatever it is, it's just advertising. It's not conversation. It's not conversational. It's not relational. We hear a lot of people talking about that, oh yeah, we had this really great communication strategy. How much of it came back to you? How much of it went out? Well, 100% of it went out. That's a communication strategy. It may be, but it's not a conversational strategy. So, both have their place.
I like the relational aspect of it because it becomes an interaction rather than just a unidirectional, like, sender to receiver.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The old model. Yeah. Thanks for joining me today, Jake. I hope this was worth your time, man. I was incredibly useful. Appreciate your time, depth in the conversation.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. It was a great conversation. Imagine that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, if people want to find more info on me, they can go to my website, jakemckee.com, MCKEE.com, and jakemckee.com/compass has a bunch more information about the conversation compass. And of course, that site as well has a sign up for the conversation lab.
You got a podcast coming out. Yeah.
Yeah, and sign up for the podcast here shortly. So, anything and everything you want to know about conversation, jakemckee.com.
Yeah, man. I'll put all of the information here, everyone, into the show notes, and hopefully we can have you back on again once you're. I know I wanted to talk about AIX, but we didn't quite get to that. But if you want to have another conversation with me, man, we'd love to have you back. So, yeah.
Oh, I'd love to come back. As you can tell, I like a good conversation about conversation. So,
yeah,
let's do it again soon.